Good afternoon, everybody. I know there's a few more still to come, but we'll get started because I've only got half an hour today. So, a really warm welcome, everybody, to this week's PPMA webinar. I do hope everybody is well. My name's Andy Dobbin, and I'm one of the vice presidents for PPMA. I also have a day job, and I'm the Chief HR Officer at Leeds City Council. And I'm really pleased today to be hosting today's webinar. As always, just a few really quick housekeeping issues to share with you before we get going. As everybody's familiar, if you could please keep your mics on mute as Steve is presenting. Fairly tight for time, but if you do have some questions of Steve, then please do put them in the chat function, and subject to time, what I'll do is I'll tease out those questions and then fire them at Steve at the end of the session, subject to time. And also, just to let you know, today's webinar is being recorded, and what we'll do is we'll share the webinar with our PPMA members at the end of the month. So really pleased that you've joined us today, and today's webinar is called One Hounslow Workforce Transformation, Leading with Heart. And as you know, it's going to focus on the London Borough of Hounslow, which is award-winning. In fact, only about a couple of weeks ago, it won and was named Council of the Year by the Local Government Chronicle. So congratulations to Hounslow and to Steve. It's a great accolade. And I'm going to hand you over now to Steve. So Steve Whitehead is the Director of HR and OD at Hounslow. He's been in that role since 2019. Some of you will know Steve, and he's a really well-respected HR leader, and he's going to share with you really, I guess, how Hounslow have achieved some transformation through their whole organisational conversation, which has resulted in the development of a new values framework. So really warm welcome to you, Steve. Thanks for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Andy. And I'm not sure that some people on the call will agree with you that I'm a very well-respected HR leader, because I can see a number of my previous direct reports on the call. Hello, you know who you are. Anyway, lovely to see everyone this morning, and thank you to the PPMA for the invitation to come along today to talk about Hounslow, to talk about how we've tackled our culture change program, really. So I've got some slides to share, which I'm not totally familiar with Zoom. Had a very good run through with Grace, though, so hopefully this is going to work. And I shall put it on slideshow. I'm afraid I can't see the chat. So as Andy mentioned, any questions coming through, he will shout at me or we'll reserve them from the end. As Andy said, hi, I'm Steve Whitehead. I'm the Director of Human Resources and Organisation Development. Not only did we win Council of the Year, but of course, we won the PPMA Award for Workforce Transformation in the last round of those awards. So really delighted with that. And that was in recognition of the work that I'm going to describe to you today. Just to say, though, this is kind of episode 1, and there'll be stuff to follow at the PPMA conference. So I'm going to take you this morning to a point in our journey, but as you as HROD professionals will know, these things just don't stop. So there will be an episode 2 to come, and do come along to the PPA conference, to that session, if that's of interest to you. But just a very brief introduction. It has been a whole organisation conversation, which at once totally freaked me out, but also absolutely energised me, because Niall's aspiration, Niall Bolger, our chief executive, was that everybody's voice should be equal in that. And when I was having early conversations with Niall, who was a relatively new chief executive at that point, he'd just taken a paper to cabinet in July. I joined in August, around his conception of a transformation programme. And I was absolutely delighted, even though I was only interim at the time, to see that the foundation of that piece was very much about people and culture. So that immediately whetted my appetite, but an enormous task, because the only thing that Niall said to me pretty much in terms of parameters for me and my team who were delivering this was that everyone's voice should be equal in the conversation. So that's like, do you actually mean 2,400 people? Then my immediate thought was, I am an interim, I know, only on a week's notice. Do I need to get Angela from Morgan Law on speed dial? But then I thought, no, this is an incredibly exciting opportunity, and probably one of the biggest things I've done in my career ever. apart from single status in Newham, those of you on the call that will remember that wonderful time. But certainly I grasped it, and the team did, in the right way, I think, and we'll talk through how we had that and delivered that whole organisation conversation, and today what the product of that was. So when I arrived, we had a leadership task group that Niall had set up to look at how we best engage with everyone across the organisation. But there, I think it's fair to say, and Alison's on the call, who supported me through thick and thin with this, it's fair to say there was a polarity of views around how we should go about doing this. So I had to remain insistent that we were doing it from the ground up and everyone's voice was equal. So there were some people, as I've experienced in other organisations, who were expecting Niall to say, these are my values and therefore they will become yours. But he was absolutely adamant that that shouldn't be so. So we had this leadership task group who'd been looking at stuff, really helpful foundation for the work that followed. What I will say is that and this won't surprise you either, but the process has been just as important as the product. And in fact, the process has become a product in itself in terms of how we engage with our people. We wanted to signal big change in terms of how we engaged with staff. We wanted to involve them in a different way, enable their participation in the stuff that really matters to them and to our residents. And this, I think it's fair to say, was a never seen before in Hounslow approach. So that ambitious whole organisation conversation, and one that continues, as I've mentioned. So our people and the trade unions that represent them were involved every single step of the way. And the change was from the ground up, as I've mentioned, and indeed we branded it very much in that way. We were determined to reach everyone, everyone's voice equal, as I've mentioned. And for that reason, we developed and trained a cohort of about 60 culture change champions, who were either volunteers for that role or were approached because they demonstrated that they had some unique talent that we thought they could bring to this whole process. And their role was very, very clear, and that was to reach into the organisation, spread the word, start and continue the conversations around culture through both their formal and informal networks, and importantly, bring all of that data back to us so that we could hear everyone's voice. So we did that in a number of ways. We had conversation. If you remember, this was pre-pandemic, so it was very much physically based. We went out to all of our office locations, to the front line, and delivered workshops, conversation hubs. We had World Cafe style events, and we had a more traditional 4-question survey approach as well, which asked 2 building questions in terms of what's good about now, and 2 aspirational questions about what do you want to see into the future so far as our culture is concerned. We gave the culture change champions some pretty first-class learning, so a good program there, and gave them a whole range of tools that they could use as they were taking forward this conversation. And to be honest, that taken together with the really clear-sighted and determined leadership messaging around this whole piece created a really unstoppable momentum, the likes of which I've never seen in my career. So we had a set of circumstances where 90% of our people were aware of how they could contribute to the conversation, and indeed 80% of them did through all of those different mechanisms. And we really got down to the front line. And in Hounslow, we directly deliver a number of those frontline services. So that was no mean feat. So we heard the views of 80% of our people. So you can only imagine how much data there was to then kind of synthesize. And that was a real challenge. But we did it, and we built from that what has become our shared values system. So having distilled all, that was the first sprint. That was the first sprint of the conversation. We had a second one that followed, which I'll describe in a few moments. But having distilled all of that data, we did get down to 9 prototype values, which really reflected the language that we'd heard through the conversations that we'd had. It was really fresh. It was really disruptive. I have to say quite openly and honestly in this relatively private group that not all of our leadership team welcomed the kind of stuff that was coming back from people. So that was a bit of a challenge of itself. But we wanted to discover through the second sprint whether the values helped us, the prototype values as they were, helped us to solve some real world issues that we were experiencing as a council in a more creative and a more imaginative way. So that was the purpose of the second sprint, as well as to develop the behaviours that kind of brought those values to life, which I'll share in a moment. So we worked with our leadership community specifically to explore some specific areas of concern. The areas that we tested our prototype values against to see whether they helped us to determine better outcomes for our residents were childhood obesity, social isolation, delivering change internally and doing that brilliantly, and also reaching out to people who were in hard to reach locations, so essentially not based in our corporate building. So a nice blend there for testing in terms of very community resident focused stuff, but also stuff that pertain to us as an organisation, how we do our business. So we found that the prototype values really did the job very, very well. But we recognise that our people, and indeed the leadership community as part of that wider workforce population, wanted to refine them just a little further. So we did that and presented what became the final set of our values. And as I said, as we'd gone through that kind of testing and learning, do they help us to do stuff better? We'd identified the behaviours under each of the value clusters that brought those values to life. And I'll share those with you now, actually. So I wanted to go through in some detail what the values and behaviours look like. So bear with me, because I'm so proud of them that I'm going to take you through in some detail, which is the slides that follow. So the values that drive us and the behaviours that bring these to life. So our first value is that we lead with heart. So we're here for the people of Hounslow. We work together with them and for them with care and compassion, with patience and in partnership. We put ourselves in others' shoes, remembering that every person is different and every interaction is a real moment in their lives, and we always feel first. And we think that the behaviours that bring those to life are that we always ask ourselves how a resident would feel, take pride in the little things and show that we care, and listen to the Hounslow people and don't ever assume that you know. So that's the first of our values, and very much reflective of the language that we heard from our people. Do new is the second. So we need to do things differently if we're going to help Hounslow people thrive in the future. Hard work is important, but it's not enough on its own. We need to challenge ourselves to break new ground, invent new approaches, try new ideas, keep moving forward and keep improving. That means being ready to stop doing things we've done before. And it also means taking on risk and backing each other when we do take a leap. And we found that the behaviours that helped us to bring those values, this value to life, were that we nurture new ideas and back them, back people when they have them, challenge process where that holds us back, and of course this continuous, and we're still engaged in this, as all of you will be, testing, learning, refining, going again. Passing on the power. The world keeps changing and we need to change with it. We won't be able to adapt fast enough to the future needs of our residents if we stick to old-fashioned command and control. Handing over responsibility, giving people more power to make decisions and take actions themselves, being transparent, straightforward, but always providing the right tools to do the jobs and the right support. But most of all, it's about being ready to trust each other to do the right thing. So the behaviours there: inspire and support rather than command and control. Trust people to do the right thing and do it right, and share responsibility and the credit. I have to say, as we're going through these, just to interrupt myself for a little bit, if you conceive that these were developed before the pandemic and we went into the second sprint through the pandemic, you'll recognise, because of the jobs that you do, the absolute opportunity that, perversely given the horrific nature of it, the pandemic presented for bringing these values to life. And I mean, we really did. We just to pause for a moment, we pretty much overnight, as many of you will have done, set up new services. We redeployed about 400 people into those new services. So these really gave us a strong foundation to articulate what we needed to become, and very, very quickly. So next one is harness the mix. We work together across disciplines and roles. We talk lots, share our insights, our skills and experience. We're not interested in silos or defensiveness. We're always open to different approaches, flexible, ready to adapt. We break down barriers between our parts and people to unlock the problem-solving power of our amazing mix of minds. This one, of course, is intended, as all of the values are, to really bring forward a very important, very significant inclusion, diversity and equity agenda too. So the behaviours here: seek different perspectives, solve problems and create opportunities, be ready and willing to adapt, always find the common ground where we can, and share the benefits and shared benefits. And lastly, be a rock. So this is about a number of things. There's lots to do and people need us. So we always need to remember why we're here, take responsibility, stand up and be counted for that accountability, and do that every day. It's about being super focused, effective and efficient. Being a rock is not something that should be static. It's rather we need to keep the momentum as we are being that very reliable thing that people need. It's about being super focused, effective and efficient, allocating our resources smartly with good rationale, using data and evidence, importantly, to guide our decisions. But most of all, it's about having the strength and determination to keep going through thick and thin. Need to take the initiative, bring energy and action, take strong evidence-based decisions, finish what you start, and never pass the buck. So that was the product in terms of the values. As I've mentioned, the engagement that we've experienced beyond that specific change has really stuck, and it was a transforming moment in terms of enabling our people to participate in corporate life, deepening their appreciation of why that participation is so important. And there was a clearer understanding of the value and power of each individual and team in increasing the sense of belonging that they felt, how they could flourish across the organisation, and contributing particularly to the organisation and our communities outside of their regular job roles. So we started with the Culture Change Champions. We've since developed these a whole range of communities of people, communities of practice that kind of are able to flourish and become really good Hounslow citizens, because they are not just focusing on the day job. So we've got our equality network groups, we've got our World of Work champions who are supporting us to become the employer that we want to be in the future. We've got our digital champions, we've got domestic abuse companions, and we've done all of this in partnership with the trade unions. So a whole organisation conversation. We've replicated that where that's been the right thing to do. We are, of course, embedding our values and behaviours across all of our strategic and operational people management. We started that, and there'll be more discussion around how we've done that at the PPMA conference, but we started very clearly with our approach to performance management and check-in conversations. So we did away with what was a pretty traditional appraisal scheme, which meant that people had a performance and development conversation but twice a year, and we've introduced monthly check-in conversations, which take in a whole range of stuff. But importantly, there's a goal setting element there for individuals to drive, and those goals have to reflect our values, as do any learning objectives that come from those very regular conversations that people are having with their managers. What I will talk about when I next have the opportunity as well is more on that, for sure, how we've developed our organisational wellness strategy using the values as a foundation piece to that, but also how we've tested, because I know people will be interested in this, how we've tested the impact of this work that we've done. And we have partnered with the Real World Group and Sea Change Consultancy. So Julia Antini will be known to many of you. And we've just delivered through the summer our My Experience Matters survey, which centred, of course, on how inclusive our leadership is, what people's experience of senior leadership is, the regular kind of engagement questions that it's so important to know about. But equally, we had clusters of questions around our values. So we've been able to really measure how impactful, how well we're bringing them to life as an organisation, how well people are able to observe them in our day-to-day operations, our day-to-day communications across the organisation. I had so much more to say, but I'm going to cut to my lastly paragraph, which is: our values join us together as a council. Of course they do. But we've always been have also been a real catalyst that's enabled us to connect even better with and harness the power of our communities in Hounslow. We don't just want to lead with heart as a major employer, we want to lead so our communities so that they can equally thrive. We want to be a rock for them as well as for our people, and it's so important as one of the most diverse places on the planet that we harness the mix. We want to pass on the power to our communities and to our partner organisations, particularly across the voluntary sector, so that we can co-design and co-create with them. And in doing so, we want to do new. So this programme of work has seen us extend beyond our organisational barriers and into the borough in the widest sense and in the most meaningful way. And I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to shut up there. But thank you so much for listening. We are Council of the Year 2021, just to remind you. But if there are any questions, I'm really, really happy to take them. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see people.
Ian, thank you so much, Steve. That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you for sharing that journey. And I'm really struck by the values you shared. I think they're fantastic. I come in Leeds from a very values-driven organisation, so what you said really resonates. We don't have any questions on the message board yet, but we've still got 5 minutes or so. So if I just kickstart, because something that I was really struck with from your presentation at the start was everyone's voice is equal and the extent of your engagement. I think you mentioned about 80% of staff contributed and engaged in the process. When we do all of that, we always struggle sometimes because it tends to be the same people, the same demographic that do the talking. So I'm really keen to understand how you got to such a high percentage of engagement and how you really reached out to those cohorts, the demographics of staff that perhaps would ordinarily be interested or contribute to this. So any sort of top tips of what you did to really engage?
Yeah, Andy, it was an enormous undertaking and it was pretty resource heavy, but I think the key to the success was the variety of channels that we enabled for people to contribute. And frankly, in some circumstances, and particularly with our digitally excluded staff, shamefully we still have some, we just had to be a bit in your face about it. So we went down to their workplaces, organised with their managers the best moments to capture as many people as we could and encouraged them to just talk to us. And we took back that contribution as well as enabled them to contribute in every other way. I didn't imagine for a moment we'd have the success that we saw. And actually the amount of data was quite daunting that we got back when you consider that's about 2,000 people contributed to that conversation. But I think it was about the enabling channels. We did things like, towards the end of the conversation, we did things like floor walking. I remember going around Hounslow House and asking those people who hadn't yet participated in the discussion too, and they broadly speaking did. So yeah, it was about the diversity of channels and the reach out as well that we achieved. We wouldn't have been able to do it without the culture change champions, because my team was incredibly small at the time. In fact, it was probably just me and Alison, broadly speaking, leading this piece, of course with the support of our corporate leadership team. But with those 60 people, when their reach out and their informal networks, their formal networks, the team meetings that they would naturally attend anyway, we got an enormous coverage across the organisation.
Real. No, that really helps. Thank you. We are getting some questions in, so just while I go through those, the final thing from me really, I was really struck with the content of the values because they come across as really very authentic, very human, very personable, which I think is fantastic. Just again, intrigued to know whether or not there was any sort of kickback from some populations that wanted a more corporate, more business focused value base, whether that was a challenge or issue for you.
Yeah, it was. I mean, and indeed, the whole process was not popular with some of our senior leaders because suddenly and overnight we became a massive democracy, and you know, some of our more recalcitrant leaders were not keen on that as a concept, let alone when they saw the values and the sort of language that we were using.
Yeah.
But you know, the leadership at the top determination to have this thing come from the people was really, really important in that context. Of course it was.
Yeah.
But actually, But even though there were reservations, and that was across the top team, you know, some of our members were a little bit cautious about the language that we were using, because we kept them up to speed with the conversation and indeed engaged them in it as we went through. But I think there was a bit of nervousness. The language did feel, as I said, a bit disruptive. It did feel a bit different. It's not what people were used to at all, but it was authentic. It had come from our people, and in that sense it was sort of inarguable. And the sentiment, I did have to encourage some people to look at the sentiment and what these behaviors, these values would achieve, rather than the specific words, and that kind of did the trick. But now I have to say, to their credit, the whole of the leadership community across Hounslow, they use these words very naturally. They've really become embedded in the DNA of the organization. They are in our vocabulary very naturally, and people have grasped them and used them and bring them to life, even where we saw that reservation initially and that slight hesitancy. So yeah,
Yeah.
it wasn't without challenges, I have to say.
Yeah, no, thank you. And in a way, you sort of partly answered Louise's really interesting observation about getting from your 9 to your final 5. Interesting question about the ones that you ditched. Were there some that were just deemed to be too disruptive or too problematic, or was it more about just refining and as Louise says, capturing the spirit of them in a different way?
It's Louise, thank you. It's probably the latter. So what we did as we had the conversation across the leadership community as we were testing those prototypes, we could see very clear relationships between some of the 9 and others of the 9. And so in that way, we distilled down to 5, but we didn't lose the essence of any of the 9 value areas in the 5 that we finally landed with. It all features somewhere in there.
Brilliant. Thanks, Steve. Okay, really mindful of time. We've got 1 minute left. So just a few final things from me then. First of all, thank you again, Steve, for the presentation. And if that won't get you to the PPMA conference, I don't know what will, because you'll see, so what did you describe as round 2 of your journey, of your story. So that would be fantastic to hear that. So thanks, Steve. More to come on that. Thank you everybody else for joining today's webinar. I really hope you enjoyed it as much as myself. And just do a quick plug for our next webinar, which is on the 26th of November at 12 noon. And Cheryl Samuels is going to lead that one, and this is going to focus particularly on inclusion and diversity. So please do attend that if you can. So thank you again, Steve. Thanks everybody for attending. And I hope everybody has a fantastic weekend, and we'll see you soon. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks, Steve.
See you later.
See you later.
Thank you.